All right. Hello and welcome to another Stryd coaching webinar. In today's webinar, we are excited to have Coach Rob Dallimore to join us and cover the topic, difficult topic in some cases, of race
Very.
planning for an Ironman distance event. All the triathletes out there will know there's a lot that goes into the race preparation, and I'm sure it's equal so for the actual race planning. So
Yeah.
we actually I bump into you every time we're in Kona, Rob. So we know you have the
Absolutely.
experience and the credentials here. Um,
Thank you.
so for those looking to qualify for the Ironman World Championship, you should definitely watch this webinar in full and follow up. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Rob.
Thanks, Matt. So, yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I mean, this initially you asked for triathlon race planning, and it I would love to have been able to go on into deeper into some of the other distances, but the nature of most of my coaching and my own racing has been around Ironman. So I figure we'll talk about Ironman, and I'm sure some of what we discuss here can be carried through to the other distances. But the thing with the Ironman is, as you know, it's a marathon at the end of a 3.8k swim and a 180k cycle. So a marathon itself is hard enough to pace, but it becomes a real challenge when it's added to the end of such a long swim and bike, and often in conditions or on a course which makes it even more challenging as well. So that's why the first thing I say to my athletes when we talk about planning for an Ironman event is I say this is not your typical running race. This is not how you would approach a marathon. It's not how you would train for a marathon. We're training for an Ironman, which is a combination of so many different factors, which comes into running in a race, which may not necessarily be much faster than what you would do for training, and in some cases may actually be even slower. And that's a real challenge for people to get their heads around, because we always think that racing means that we need to be pushing ourselves faster and faster. But in an Ironman, the the best or the most successful performance is one where you've slowed down the least, not necessarily got faster through the race. And as it happens, there's always that chance to be able to sprint the last 400 meters if you've got something left. But really, what I try to get out of my own athletes is the ability to hold a pace for as long as they can, and very, very few are able to pick that pace up towards the end. So we try to get them set up with a race plan to ensure that they can hold a pace for 3 hours, 4 hours, some of them 5 hours. So one thing we found, and I stole this quote off a very good friend of mine who's a applied biomechanist, Greg Payne, who does a lot of work with Olympic kayaking athletes, but he also does a lot of work with my own Ironman athletes, is that the total triathlon time is more highly correlated to the run time than the swim and bike times combined. So what you can find from that is a triathlon performance as a whole, swim, bike, run, three legs, is heavily weighted towards the performance of the run, and much more than what you will swim and bike. So with saying that, there's a great quote that we've often said: swim and bike for show, run for dough. And it's the one where, yeah, you can have a great swim and bike, but if you can't put the run leg together, then we're not going to see you performing as you potentially could, or as you may want to. So that's a really important thing to consider, because it comes into this whole story of, we need to get you to start that run with the least amount of stress possible to eke out the most amount of performance from your run time. And there's so many things that come into it. So obviously the swim and cycle legs precede the run. If we would talk about duathlon, which is run, bike, run, that's quite a different story, because the first run leg of a duathlon is often as hard as just a single one-off running race. But we won't talk about that right now, because that's a whole different webinar. But the effect of the swim and cycle legs of the triathlon race will heavily affect how you can run. And the swim conditions, for starters, if we look at Kona, which is a great example, it's an open water swim. It's usually in a rough rolling swell. It might be quite a challenging swim course to perform as you could or as you should in the swim. Might require you to kick a little bit more to keep your body position, keep your propulsion in check, and that can affect later on your run, because the more you kick, the harder you kick, the more you use your quads and your calf muscles, and the more that can become a factor later on. Other courses such as Ironman New Zealand, which is in a freshwater lake, but we swim with a wetsuit, means that you can actually swim a much more comfortable pace without as much kick, because you have some flotation in your legs. That means that coming on later on in the race, when you do run, maybe you haven't stressed your legs quite as much, and you're able to get a little bit more performance out of them. So the swim conditions will have a massive effect on the race 8, 9, 10 hours later. And we really try to condition our athletes for swimming to a point that we have a goal of improving your running through that. So there's a lot of factors that come into that. The other one is the bike power, the intensity of the ride. I've just seen a spelling mistake there. I've put ideally 280 watts. That's terrible advice. It should actually say 280 TSS. Don't go and do an Ironman ride at 280 watts, especially if you're a 60 or 70 kilo athlete. That would be a bad day out. 280 TSS, which is training stress score. 280 is what we find to be the most um, the most optimal stress from the bike ride to allow a well conditioned runner to run very, very well off that. If we come through to the end of the bike and someone's ridden at 250, 240 TSS, we usually see that their run performance is greatly increased. If someone comes off the bike with 320, 340, 350 TSS, then normally we see their run performance is affected significantly. So training the bike leg to get that 280 TSS and checking how people run after that is really, really important. It's a really important part of our training. The other thing comes into tactics during the cycle leg. So, how smooth was that power output? Was there some surging through it? Was it a hilly course? Were they perhaps not putting quite as much effort in, and therefore maybe affecting just the overall general feeling of the race? Did they feel like they were never really able to settle into the cycle leg, which could affect their run performance later on? Or did they just go through that bike leg like it was absolutely um, to a T, no problems at all, come off the bike feeling amazing, and set themselves up for a great run? So there's so many scenarios that I'll talk to an athlete before going to an Ironman race and saying, what happens? What do we do if this happens on the bike? What do we do if this happens on the bike? How are you going to cope with something like this happening on the bike? Because as it comes down to, the run is such an important thing. So setting someone up for a great Ironman run performance comes down heavily to how they approach that cycle leg. The other one we look at a lot is climate, and as Matt would have said many times before, it's the amount of power that you can put out and in a higher temperature environment is much, much harder. Here in New Zealand, when we're racing and training for Kona, we have the disadvantage of being in winter. So for us, most of our training is done in under 20 degrees Celsius. In fact, it doesn't really get much higher than that through summer anyway. But most of the training through our winter, June, July, August, September into October, we will be anywhere from 5 to 15 degrees Celsius. And suddenly putting an athlete into a 35, 40 degree humid environment, it's completely different. So I have to make sure our athletes understand that the power they're going to be putting out when they're running out along the Lee Drive is going to be much, much lower than what they can put out here in New Zealand when they're running off the bike after a hard ride. And that's a really, really hard thing for me to spell out to an athlete unless they've actually been to Kona before and they've experienced what that heat does to them. So that's another thing that we need to make sure we do. The footwear, again, it's a interesting issue. I mean, I've got so many different types of running shoes. I've got carbon plated, I've got non-carbons, I've got heavy training shoes, I've got lightweight racing flats. I still haven't really spent the time seeing how power output is affected by the type of shoe that we're running in, but I'm sure there is a just difference. And I do prepare people for the scenario that one pair of shoes might set them up with a different power output than another pair of shoes. And if it's something that they're used to, and they understand, then it's not a great shock to the system. The other thing is that we find that if someone is going to be running an Ironman at a slower time, then they're better off wearing a heavier or a more comfortable shoe than they would if they were doing a faster time, just because they're going to be spending more time on their feet. An athlete is running close to 3 hours or 3 hours 10 off the bike will probably wear a very lightweight, with these days carbon plated shoes, but in the past they weren't necessarily carbon plated. Whereas someone who's running 4 or 5 hours will probably do it in their training shoes, really nicely cushioned, really comfortable. One thing we try to do is simulate the expected race conditions. So I talked a little bit about that before. We're looking at inducing some fatigue in an athlete on the bike leg, so I can have them running off the bike at an expected race effort or race power to give them that mental confidence that that yep, this is the right effort for me, this is the right power for me. If I send an athlete out for a long run fresh, they will probably come back having run much higher power or faster pace than they would have if it was a race, and that's not really useful for them in their own mind. It's great for an aerobic advantage. There's a lot of gains from that, but I do try to make sure that I've done enough workouts through a training block that they can understand what 280 TSS feels like, how they run after that. And there's a number of weekends that I will dedicate to that sort of workout as we come closer to the race. I love a critical power test, but I've not always found the critical power test is ideal to set the athlete's critical power and determine race targets. The main reason for this is training for an Ironman is hugely fatiguing, and we find athletes struggle to put out their best potential over the distances or the durations required for a critical power test. So then you sort of wonder, how useful is that information? A lot of the athletes are reluctant to do that sort of thing in a deep phase of training, partly because they just don't want to know that they can't put out the pace that they used to be able to do when they were doing shorter course training. And I think so much of Ironman is a confidence thing. So I don't really want to give athletes that concern. The other one is risk of injury. One thing you do find with high performing athletes is they want to, if they are going to do a test workout, they're going to try and push themselves to the limit. And there is always that risk of hamstring strain or other injury coming about from just running too fast in a situation that's not really required or not really ideal. And so I've got other ways of figuring out race targets, and it's taken me a few years to sort of know what is right and how to set that for athletes, for different types of athletes. So I've sort of avoided going away from critical power tests in the last 6 to 8 weeks of a training plan, and we'll talk a little bit about later on about how the power duration curve will look for an Ironman athlete as well, and you'll sort of understand why auto calculation for critical power isn't necessarily useful either. Um, but I'm open to suggestions as well. If anybody finds that yep, there is a way around that, then obviously that's fantastic to hear. The thing with Stryd is, so it is still very new technology and very new understanding that I'm kind of learning as we're going, and I guess a lot of people are the same. But having had 4 or 5 years, I guess I'm trying to think when the first Summit product came out. Having used that product from day one, then I've sort of found over the time which has worked, what hasn't worked. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about some cases of athletes that I've got. So this is great timing because last 2 weeks ago we had Ironman Cairns, which is the Ironman Asia Pacific Championship, and it was a key race for our athletes because we've been locked away in New Zealand for 2 years now, I think. And for a lot of these athletes, it was their first time overseas. Ironman New Zealand, which was in March, was cancelled. So all these athletes were training for Ironman New Zealand. Suddenly have it cancelled. We've got to find another race for them to do. And it just happened that a few weeks after that, Ironman New Zealand was scheduled to be on. Our borders opened again and travel was available. So our athletes will look straight to Ironman Cairns. Perfect timing. And we just carried that build across. So I've got three really, really good case studies, which I'll take you through. So the first one I'm particularly proud of. It was a female athlete. She won the overall age group race. She was actually the fourth. She was fifth overall female. So there were only 4 professional athletes ahead of her. She ran 3 minutes slower than the fastest runner on the day. So there were 2 female athletes that ran faster than her, and they were only 3 minutes faster than they were professional athletes. So we're talking a very high performing age group athlete. She's podiumed at Kona. She's won every Ironman or 70.3 age group race that she's been in for the last few years. And I've been lucky enough to have worked with her from day one through this process, and she's used the Stryd for this whole thing. So I've got some amazing data from her. So she's 40 years old. So she's had 4 years of experience racing with Stryd in a number of different events, and she's equal strength across all 3 legs. So I would look at her swim, bike, and run, and I can't really see anyone that's particularly stronger than the other, but probably her run in the sense that she's mentally very, very tough, and she can put together a very strong run. And probably has the ability to go a lot deeper in her performance than a lot of athletes can. Critical power, 244 watts. We'll talk a little bit about this. Actually, I'll talk about this now. The critical power, 244 watts. Now, I had her doing a critical power test probably 2 months prior to this race, and she blew it out of the water, and it put her critical power up to about 265 watts. And we sort of decided that was just too high, and it was because she's the sort of athlete that pushed herself to the absolute limit and would come away with a number that was so high that to set training zones off that and race zones off that was just unrealistic. And I was having her running sessions which it just didn't work right. They were just too hard for her to complete. So using a little bit of estimation and a bit of guesswork, we pulled it back to 244 watts, and I found that's been pretty much bang on for what I needed her to be able to base her race power off. So 244 watts, we'll call that was her critical power. She did have hamstring and calf. I won't call it an injury, but it was certainly a niggle. Between 4 and 6 weeks prior to the race, and you can see the gap in the in the in the graph there below, just between May and the beginning of May and the mid-May, where she wasn't running at all. Prior to that, there'd obviously, as you can see, there'd been some pretty big workouts, and running had been going really, really well. After that, in the return to running, you can see that the training load had been a lot less, with a couple of building workouts, and then the last one you can see there is actual race day. So I think in my mind that actually the injury state in those 4 to 6 weeks prior probably didn't have a negative effect on the performance, but it certainly her confidence was affected by it. But actually, my confidence, I was actually pretty glad there was a couple of quiet weeks there, because she was blowing herself out of the park with the way the training had been going. So it was quite good to be able to put the brakes on a little bit there, and I think it actually helped race day. If we look at the performance itself, so Ironman Cairns 2022, her cycle leg was 249 TSS. Now, I spoke a little bit earlier about 280 TSS being the target for an optimal race. When you see a rider come off with a low TSS, 250 or less, then we know that they've set themselves up for a really, really, really good run, and we proved this on the day. The reason for that lower cycle leg training stress was because she had sort of become I guess enveloped by a group of age group male athletes who were riding much stronger than her, so she couldn't ride away from them, but they weren't riding strong enough that she could drop off the pace. So for her to be sitting at a slower speed, lower power output for the last 30 k's of the ride brought that overall stress of the ride down a huge amount, and set herself up for this great run. The RSS from the run was 262, which is very, very high for a run off the bike, for a marathon run off the bike. Um, and I think that's basically because she had that particularly soft bike ride. The bike leg was still 507. So for those of you who know an Ironman bike split, anything around 5 hours is a very, very fast time, and 507 was the fastest age group time by far, and it wasn't far off what the professional women were riding as well. So we're looking at a really high performing athlete here. So I gave her the race plan prior to the race, and so my expectations of her were coming off the bike with that 280 TSS. So I gave her a target power of 210 to 215 watts, which in my mind would have been um, bang on for having done the expected bike leg. She's the sort of athlete that really understands how her body's feeling. So she just went out on feel. This feels right. I'm just going to run this pace. She was already in the lead of the age group race. She already had a good lead, so it wasn't like she was trying to chase anybody. And her first hour was 230 watts, which you can see was a lot higher than what I'd planned it to be. But we'll see a little bit later on why that actually worked out well, and why that was the pace that she ran at, or the power she ran at. The final hour dropped off a fair bit, as you can see, 218 watts, but it still wasn't as low as what I targeted at 210 to 215. So her run performance exceeded my own plan for her, which is fantastic. I love getting proven wrong in those situations. Um, Now, the reason why I think that 230 watts was so comfortable, and I probably should have looked at this a little bit closer and thought, actually, this is what can be done, is 3 weeks prior, her runs off the bike um, were done at 230 watts. And in the weeks prior to her injuries as well, the same sort of thing. The runs off the bike were being done at 230 watts, and this was running off a long hard ride where she'd been at or over 280 TSS. So she had basically grained into herself, this is 230 watts. This is what it feels like. I can run this off the bike, and as you can see on race day, that was proven exactly right. All her long runs, all her fresh long runs without a ride beforehand, were done at 230 watts as well. So, and that was 440 per k on an undulating course. And as you can see on the Ironman day, she ran 439 per k, and it was a dead flat course, but with a lot of twists and turns. So you can see now that you know training for an Ironman and planning for an Ironman is so heavily weighted to the confidence that an athlete can build by just developing and just drilling into them. This is a comfortable pace. This is what you can do. This is what you can do off the bike. This is how it's done. And she just conditioned herself to feel this was normal. Now, this was a discussion we'd had probably 2 years earlier. Was both of us decided that 3:15 marathon run off a bike was the target, and at the time she was a 3:25 runner. So, and we looked at the pace and thought, okay, it's 4:37 to 4:30 per k, 4:40 per k, depending on the course. We weren't too sure what the power output would be for that, but we knew that a 3:15 run was the target. And I remember this discussion 2 years ago was, this is going to be really tough, and I don't know if we can do it. But we'd focused on this pace for a long, long time, and got it down. And I think overall, from the race itself, this is probably the most satisfying result, is that pace that we looked at 2 years ago, that became exactly what was run on this day. So as we move forward, and you can just see through in that graph there, you can just see that a high performing athlete who runs a very good Ironman run is very, very smooth and consistent in all metrics across the whole race. And you can see that even at the end there was a little lift in effort. So And this was the reason why there's lots of little ups and downs is it's a very tight, twisty course. So there's lots of stop starts, a couple of aid stations where she may have walked through just to get as much fueling as she can on. But as soon as she started running again, ground contact time was consistent, limb stiffness was consistent, vertical oscillation was consistent, um, and it's that's a great picture to look at. Um, Taking it forward, so where do we go now? So Kona planning, we're already looking straight at 2022 Kona. She's already qualified a spot for this, and we're going to use her data from 2019, where she placed fourth in her age group, and the information that we got from this recent Ironman Cairns as to how Ironman Kona 2022 is going to go. We have some really specific goals for that race, performance and time goals, and we're going to target the training directly for that. So the interesting thing was the power duration curve in the 90 days prior to Kona 2019 was actually higher than it was in the 90 days prior to Cairns 2022. And her Kona 2019 race, the run leg wasn't actually done quite as well as we thought it might. And I think a lot of that came down to strategy on the bike and possibly running too hard at the start of the run. So she was actually she was in a better place in terms of power output before that race than she was prior to the Cairns race, but probably execution on the day didn't quite go to plan. So if I can get her to 90 days prior to Kona 2022 in a similar state that she was prior to Cairns, then I know that we're going to be doing very well. And even if she can get closer to how she was pre-Kona 2019, I think we'll be going even better again. The thing to note that there was quite a large drop off in for that 90 minutes onwards from that power duration curve, just because the last part of that Kona race was a lot slower than she'd run at Cairns. So the heat really affected that day, and that was shown in the performance. The interesting thing with Kona 2019, the bike TSS was much higher. So we talked about that 280 being the target, being the gold standard. 318 is quite a high TSS for a bike ride versus 249, which she rode at Cairns. So again, I'm going to find a way that we can condition her for higher than a 280 TSS, something closer to that 320, and still having her run, close to that 230 relative 230 watts off the bike. So keeping in mind, we're looking at going to be a less power output off the bike in Kona. So it'll be something around that same effort, perceived exertion. Her run performance was much better now than it was pre-Kona 2019, and that was off a lower RSS per week, quite significantly lower. And there's lots of other factors that would have affected that Kona run performance. As I said before, bike intensity was much harder. Really important for the first hour of that run along Elite Drive that it's not higher than the target power. That's something that we probably missed last time. I expect her power output would put to be probably 20 watts less for the run, so 230 watts in Cairns. Even though it was quite a hot day, it wasn't Kona hot. We might look at 210 to 215 being the target or the expected average for that. The ability to fuel really, really well through the heat is going to be a real challenge. And for that fact, we're doing heat acclimation training 10 to 14 days prior to going to Kona. So those last two factors are going to be really important. So the training will be focused on being comfortable for long durations with a race power target of 210 to 220 off a harder ride than we expect than we had at Cairns. So stepping up the bike training, be more focused on the run training, and that's going to set up for what I think will be a great race at Kona. So that's case study one. Case study two. This was another athlete who's already qualified for Kona. So we treated this race as a test for how he is going to cope with his first race in Kona. So this will be his first time racing Hawaii Ironman World Champs. So he's a male Ironman age group, and he placed second in his age group. He was only 19 seconds off first, and The problem with this race was that it was a staggered start, rolling start, so we had no idea how close he really was until about the last 1 or 2 Ks, and he ran out of road, basically. He's 28 years old. He's actually his marathon PB is actually 240, mid 240s, and he ran that solo from another of our COVID lockdown cancelled marathons twice. The same race twice in 2 years. He ran them both on his own, and he ran both times. He ran mid 240s, so he's a very good runner. He's got a very high critical power, 367 watts, and but soon after this race, he tested positive for COVID-19. So I suspect that some of the symptoms that he had during the race weren't necessarily performance related, but probably from some systemic infection, possibly from COVID-19, possibly with the effects from travel, etc. So not making excuses, but it's explained a little bit of what we'll find happened. And as you can see from his training graph, he's a pretty consistent runner. Pops in with some pretty good hard workouts, but most of them is all lower RSS, pretty sustainable work. We didn't have any injuries going through this build, which has always been a good goal to be able to have. So his race, Ironman Cairns 2022, he had a really low power on the bike, and we're still trying to figure out why this was. He thinks possibly dehydration. I think possibly he had some effects of COVID. He just wasn't able to put out the power that he wanted to, and it was a bit of a shame because we really wanted this to be a really nice bike ride for him. His run RSS was 176, which, as you can compare it to the previous case, who was 262, his run performance was actually way lower than the comparison athlete who would be at the front of the age group race. So that's something to think about. Was he carrying something going into that race? His target for the first 10K was 310 watts, and he ran 310 watts. So he ran out of transition with the intention of running the exact plan that we'd set for him, and he knew that he could do this. It wasn't going to be a shock to the system, but there was something else that was going on in there. He faded quite significantly through the middle section. You can see there were a few stops through aid stations. He had to stop a couple of times, have a word to himself, and he picked up the last hour to run it at 304 watts. So he managed to pick up at the end, and some of that was from me telling him that he was beginning to close in on first place, and he finished with just a low 4-minute Ks for the final kilometer, which is at the end of an Ironman is for an age grouper is fantastic. All his long runs were focused around 320 watts. That was what we targeted as his race pace. It was race power, and they were all 420 per K on undulating courses. So this performance left us a little bit short on what we wanted to achieve. He was getting cramp early in the swim, and he felt it through the bike and the run. And when someone reports cramp in the swim, and you know that they're a natural swimmer and it shouldn't be something that happens, we know that there's something going on in their body towards that, because there's no reason for a very well trained top end age grouper to cramp in the swim. So maybe it was electrolyte balance if he was carrying some sort of bug. We don't know. So we can just ascertain what could have been happening there. But as you can see, his metrics were a little bit messy. I was particularly happy that his ground contact time maintained consistency the whole way. So even though he was feeling he was falling apart, he was actually still running a good, consistent rhythm. It's just that vertical oscillation was beginning to go, form power was beginning to drop off, and it was just a bit of a steady decline. But he was still, in his head, he was still running with the same steady stride. He was still having that good contact time, and he in the end he's still a natural runner, so it wasn't foreign to him. He finished with a 3:13 run. I probably, in my mind, would think he would have gone very close to low 3 hours, probably just under, which is why we saw him running at around that 420 per K pace pretty comfortably on his long run. So we've got a lot that we can come away from this race. Certainly wasn't a failure, but it was definitely something that we can look at and think, all right, that's where things could have been a bit different. So looking ahead for him, as we know, it's his first time at Kona, so this is going to be a big learning curve for him. We need to get used to sustaining a higher bike power with less effort, and that's something that the training is going to be geared towards. I'm going to be having him going into Kona as strong a cyclist as he can be, so he can end up riding at a lower intensity, relative intensity, and try to have the least amount of effect on that run. He's doing 70.3 in September in Sunshine Coast in Australia, 4 weeks prior to that race, and that's going to be a good test of how he is. I'll still get him to race at 70.3 intensity, but I'd just like to be able to see how he's going and his running off the bike and how his how rhythmical he is. We're going to be building a lot more time at race power, and the thing with Ironman running and Ironman racing is, as we've said before, the race power isn't necessarily that fast. It's probably slower or about the same pace that they would run for their long runs anyway. And so that's that's just a matter of going out and running, getting comfortable, getting used to it, finding ways to get the heart rate down, minimizing any extra movement, and just having that body drilled into holding that race power. I'd love to be able to have access to lactate testing for this guy, because it would be really interesting to see how his lactate was altering as he goes through that sort of Ironman simulation run session. Because it'd be interesting to see if he's still staying in that aerobic zone at that intensity. So the things that we need to be aware of that could affect his Kona run performance. I suspect he probably will ride about 280 TSS, but it could be higher than that. It could be up to 320, as we know. I know he and I would have, when I've raced Kona, I've probably been at a similar performance level to where he is at the moment, and I've come off that with between 280 and 310 TSS. So what I've learned in Kona, I can carry across to what this guy will be doing as well, because we were at a similar performance level at the time. Although he's a better runner than me, much better runner. His fueling and pacing for that first hour is going to be very important. Again, it's that same thing as we said the previous case. Running along an E drive is really, really important to dial that in very quickly. But the thing I've spoken to him about is I want him running at his best when he gets up onto the Queen K, and I've got him thinking about that in his mind. So 16, 18K into the run, that's when you're going to start running at his best. That's going to be when we're holding our target power. I've set that around about 290 watts. I think that'll probably be about right. We'll reevaluate that as we get closer to the time, but that's a little bit less than what he would have held at Cairns, and will be obviously the heat and conditions will be affecting that. One thing with Kona is when they are up on a Lee drive, it's actually quite a different climate to where it is down. Sorry, when you're up on the Queen K, it's quite a different climate to where it is down on the Lee Drive. It's not far. It's not much higher in elevation. It's actually not. It's not that far away from it. But there's a little bit more wind exposure. Might be a little bit cooler. Still not cold, or still extremely hot. But there is that section where they will be able to control effort and heart rate a little bit more along that part. So that's what we'll be talking about. He's pretty good fueling, but I think probably he hasn't raced in the heat before, so it's going to be a big thing for him. So yeah, maintaining adequate hydration, cooling himself through that run section is going to be the most important. And as we've said before, the hotter you are, the harder it is to put out target power, bring the body temperature down, get back onto that power target. So for him, it'll be about 290 watts, and I might hold him back a little bit. We'll probably have him about 290 watts, actually, come to think of it, for most of that run, but I want him to think about consciously holding back a little bit along the first section along the drive. So the next case study, the third one we'll talk about, was another female Ironman athlete who raced Ironman Cairns, and she finished fourth in her age group. She's 55 to 59 age group, and she's a very, very good endurance runner. She runs a lot of cross-country races here in New Zealand. Critical power of 226. There were some personal things that happened in this build-up, which probably, I think, carried through to how she went on race day. But for her, just getting out of New Zealand was as much of a challenge itself. That was just that was more exciting than actually doing the race. And that was a big thing for her to be able to do that. So to have her do an Ironman was a great thing. And as you can see through her RSS graph, she actually does quite a lot of running. She's a very natural runner. Loves her high volume, runs loving intensity. And for me, it's just been having her remain injury free, which we've been successful with. It was a challenge for her a few years ago, but now we're in a good spot with her running. So her race, her Cairns 2022, and you'll freak out when you see this graph. So she rode 345 TSS, which again it's higher than that 280. But the thing that we find with a slower Ironman athlete, but she is an older age group, so we do find that they don't go quite as fast as the younger ones. The more time you're on the bike, the more TSS you're going to be finding. So actually 345 TSS for her was about what I expected she would have done. Maybe a little bit more, but we're still in the right place. Her run RSS was 179. Now this is really interesting because it was 140 for the first 2 hours of that run. So for the last hour 35, it was pretty much stop start, walk jog the whole way, and that meant that she ended up having with a relatively low RSS, and you can tell from that she was left wanting a lot more from this run. The first 10K is 190 watts target, and she ran 188. So she went out of transition with the intention to have a great run. But what we've now found out um, in review is that she was underfueled for most of the bike on the run. She doesn't really know why that happened. Maybe she just wasn't consciously thinking about fueling, but that's something that we're going to be working on a lot more now going into her next races. There was no problem with her run endurance. I had no reason at all to think that she was going to not have as good a run as she could have. She did feel that she was cramping. She was also cramping a little bit through the swim and through the bike. So and then into the run as well. So I'm not sure. She hasn't tested positive for COVID, but you know something was going on. Early on in that run, you can see that she was running beautifully. All standard metrics were super consistent, and then something happened about 3 hours into it, where she had to stop. She had to have a stop, but as soon as she got started again, she really, really struggled to get moving. And as you can see, that extremely sporadic graph that you can see is her. And I had to ask her what was going on in this section, and it was because she would do 3 or 4 paces and she'd have to stop. She'd run 3 or 4 paces and she'd had to stop. And she said she just couldn't get moving again. And it was pretty heartbreaking for her because she could just see her race slipping away. She had already been up into second place in her age group. We really wanted her to finish on a podium, and so to know that she was struggling so much through the later part of that run was really hard for her. And once she got to the final 4K, she strung it together and she ran it out the whole way. And it was because someone was running with her at the time and just encouraging her to keep on going. So what I think was happening there was that she probably was so low on fuel that her concentration was affected. And when your concentration is affected, it's very, very hard to just tell the body to keep moving. So looking at that, we come back to probably the last hour of the bike and the first 20 minutes of the run, what was happening in fueling then. And in hindsight, there wasn't enough going in, wasn't enough calories. So as soon as her neurological system, her brain activity was affected, then the whole race was affected as well. So the plan didn't quite go to plan, but I can see exactly where things fell apart and how we can make it happen for the next time. So looking for her, Ironman New Zealand 2023 is the next focus. I really think she'll be able to run under 4 hours. It's definitely within her reach. We just need to make sure that she's strong on the bike, has plenty in the reserve for the run, and I'm going to get her doing a lot more harder rides where she's running at a focused pace for longer efforts, longer durations. And it's going to be really interesting. That's my next project, is to get her up to that true potential, get her back to Kona. So just in summary, as we're looking at going back over these cases, one thing that I've found is, and we've sort of based this off some of the information that we've had from some of the other experts with Stryd, as to the sort of power output that a runner can hold for a straight marathon, half marathon, 10K, etc. I've taken that information and modified it to what an Ironman athlete would be able to do. So a high performing age group or a professional athlete should be able to hold 90% of critical power, provided the bike has been paced around about that 280 TSS. So there's two cases. The first one, obviously case one, where she rode 249 TSS and she held 90% of critical power for that whole run. And the other one was a professional athlete that I coach who came second in Ironman Australia, Rebecca Clark. Her critical power was 90% of critical. Her run power was 90% of critical power for the marathon there, and she ran one of the fastest marathons in that race. So 90% critical power for a high performing age group, a very high performing age group, and a professional athlete, I think is about what we expect to see. Bringing that down to most age group athletes who feel they are strong runners and have paced the bike well, feel to the plan, I think that figure should be about 85% of critical power. Now, if we look at case two, I had a plan to start him at 85%. He finished at 80%, but we sort of know that if circumstances had been in his favour on that race, that he should have finished at 85%, maybe even a little bit higher. So that's a good standard to work off from there. And then it's hard to work back from there to more beginning type age group athletes, because for them walking might be a strategy of part of the race, and it's very hard to set an average power target when there's going to be walking in place. So what I'll generally say is for most people to start out an Ironman run at 80% of critical power. That's where we want to start your run at, and whether you bring walking into it is a decision that the athlete does, but understand that walking will reduce the average power significantly, and that needs to be taken into consideration during the race. So when they're back running between aid stations, for example, they're back at that 80% of critical power, or maybe slightly over if they do have that target of wanting to hold that for the whole run. They've got their walk break, back into the run, walk break, back into the run, and just repeat that. So as I said before, I haven't found it ideal to use auto critical power or the critical power test to determine strategy, unless we're super confident that the power duration curve is accurate. And so to get around that, I will use the run off the bike workouts after the key sessions, and probably the 6 to 8 weeks prior, to actually learn what that true power output for the race will be. And we may not even talk about power output for the race until race week itself, because for a lot of these athletes, I've found that as they taper and as they freshen up, that ability to hold a certain power output's improved quite a bit. And if you're using information and data from an athlete who's 6 weeks out from an Ironman, the running that they're doing is going to be slightly fatigued anyway, and it might actually skew the interpretation of that data. So I might wait until they've had 1 or 2 weeks of relative taper, and then a weekend out from the race, we'll do another workout which has a very specific build set to it, where I'll have them starting out at 80%. I'll get them to lift to 85. I'll get them to finish at 90%, and I'll just see how they respond in that workout, and then build my plan for them off that session. And that's what I found to be the most accurate, rather than looking at the critical power and just applying a calculation to that. I'll take that information and then just basically use a little bit of art, a little bit of science, and we'll just find out what works best. Talk to the athlete about it, get their feelings on that, and we'll go from there. But then the final thing to remember is that run performance is so heavily influenced by climate, the effort on the bike, the footwear, and the motivation of the athlete, that it might look one thing on paper, but there might be so many things that come into it. And because the Ironman run is, for most people, 6 hours after they've started the day, you're already 6 hours of aerobic activity into it. There's no telling how the athlete's going to respond until they actually get to that point. All we can do is make assumptions and make set plans and scenarios around or set plans around various scenarios as they go into it. So it does take a lot of testing, practice, discussion, trusting the coach, trusting the athlete, and just trusting that process. So if you've got any questions.
Excellent. Great stuff. I mean, amazing results for one, from the athletes, and even for the cases where the athletes maybe didn't perform up to their hopes. It looks like a lot of great insights. I liked how you have already looking forward for each athlete into their next race, and it's kind of a bigger picture, even for case study one athletes. You've been working with them.
I need them to keep me employed. I need to keep them. They need to keep me employed, so I have to give them scenarios before they can think of firing me.
Well, it's good. Yeah, it's good to have something on the horizon. I've found with those races. I was really curious to ask a question on this this balance that you point out between your bike TSS and run RSS. It's great that we have like this range for bike TSS for optimal pacing, or giving you a chance to run off the bike well. I'm curious, with the range of athletes you're working with, top level age group, should be professional, to the age group. Do you how much leniency do you give for that bike pacing portion of the race? Do you try to set a small target of the 280 TSS and then just give them a chance off the run, or do you ever tries to optimize that bike further?
A lot of the athletes, they have a race brain, so they will follow the race as they feel it needs to go. So I'll let them. I'll give them that suggestion that say, okay, if you ride 280 TSS, and there's a way of figuring it out or setting it up on their bike computer screen so they can keep an eye on it. And I'll say to them, if you've ridden 280 TSS, then you know that this is probably where you're going to be on the run. If you've ridden less than 280 TSS, then you know that inside you've actually got that ability to run a little bit faster or less. Then you need to get some fueling in. Or if they've gone over 280, then okay, you need to get some fueling into you towards the end of the bike and into the start of the run before you even think about your run pace. And a lot of them, I think a lot of them are actually blind to that, because the excitement of the race sort of takes over and they forget to look at what they were doing until the end of the ride, and then they think, oh damn, I didn't realize what it was, and they start out the run and they go flying out of transition at the rate of knots. And I just come back to them and say, only you know what it is. I haven't got that information in front of me. I can only tell them what I see. But the athlete has to go into that coming off the bike with an understanding of how much effort this took them, what they can do at the start of the run. So I'll give them different scenarios and I'll say, if it was this, you can do this. If it was this, you can do this. And just rely on the athlete. Hopefully they're experienced and skilled enough to be able to figure it out pretty quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess there's so many things that can happen in a race that you kind of just have to lay out different options and give a guide. You mentioned like the heat, humidity, the temperature, the pacing, nutrition. I'm sure that, biking, mechanicals can happen. Things can occur in the race. You have to be prepared for those.
Yeah, the other difficulty is the way Ironman races are structured now is you actually have no idea where you are in the age group race until someone on the side of the road can tell you, because they're rolling starts. So someone might start the race 2 or 3 minutes behind you, and you don't know that until after the race, and suddenly it's like, oh, they beat me, but I never saw them in the race at all. So it becomes a real individual time trial where we're just trying to get the best out of the athlete. And where possible, someone on the side of the road, a coach or a family member, can try and do some calculations and figure out who else is in contention. The difference being with the professional athletes who start together. So Rebecca's race in Ironman Australia was a great one, because she's one of the fastest swimmers in the world. So we know that she's always going to be first out of the water. We always knew that she was going to get caught on the bike, and all she had to do was keep with the leader on the bike and get off and keep her in sight on the run. And as it played out, that's exactly what happened. She got caught. She came off the bike with the leader, probably ran out of transition a little bit too quick, because she might have got a little bit excited, and so she was leading for the first 8Ks or so. And I think in hindsight, that was probably probably not the right strategy. But when you're a professional athlete racing for money and the prize money at the line, you just take those opportunities because they just feel right. And so I didn't see that as a failure. I just saw that as this is how she interpreted the race to be going at the time. And then in hindsight, yep, probably wasn't the right move, but actually wasn't a terrible move because it still meant that she was still only a minute down on the winner at the end of the race. So yeah, those sorts of strategies really come into it, and it takes a very skilled, very smart athlete to be able to figure out what's the best thing at the time.
Yeah, I feel Ironman experience is huge when it comes to that distance.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe to relate to that with, you mentioned prescribing simulation workouts to build the athlete's
Mm.
confidence, maybe more so than like the training effect in some cases. Um, I'm curious, for those race simulations, do they always are they always labeled as such, or do you sneak them into normal bike workouts and runs? Because you mentioned running off the bike for Ironman, that the power you're running at is kind of like your easy long run
Yeah,
power. So you're kind of doing that intensity in a lot of your runs already, but you just need to add that fatigue. Um, in your legs beforehand, and I'm curious how you
yeah,
do that fatigue in some cases.
yeah. You're smart on that one. I made the mistake of calling them test workouts and simulation sessions, and end up thinking, and the poor athlete goes into this terrible stress state in the days beforehand, thinking I've got to do this test on the weekend, and I'm not comfortable for it. So all I end up doing now is just plan them a workout. They don't know that I'm thinking of it as a key session. I'll give them pretty strict instructions on it, but um, I would like to get them doing it without that fear or conscious effect of it being a test.
Mhm.
And but there are certainly workouts that I plan and think, right, this will be good to see how this athlete copes with it. And I've also said to an athlete, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going too hard in a workout and finding your limit. There are things wrong with going too easy and effectively wasting a day and
Mhm.
coming away from it without useful information. I'd rather see an athlete hit the wall, 30k to go on a bike, workout, start a run, and really struggle, and then pull themselves out of a hole because they've been able to feel through it. Because I think there's some really useful information there, rather than seeing an athlete come off the bike from a bike session, having not pushed themselves quite to the limit they should have, get onto the run, dawdled a little bit, stopped and patted some dogs, which is okay, but and then come away from it and think, well, that actually wasn't much use. We've wasted a day here.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so yeah, that's a really good question because I've learnt my mistake before, and now my athletes don't know when they're getting tested.
That's fair. No, I'm just asking from my own experience. I know if there's a test sets, I want to race myself, and so then
Oh,
you
I
know,
hate test sets. I hate them. I absolutely
yeah,
hate them. I'm terrible when it comes to doing a time trial.
it's good practice for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe related to that as well, do you, we kind of kept this talk specific to Ironman distance. I assume these athletes, mix in other distance races. Do they do halves? Do you ever look at halves and try to, um, you know, use that to influence your full Ironman race plan for the athletes?
They do halves, but I don't actually take the information from the half and extrapolate that out to an Ironman. Basically, because it's double. You know,
Mhm.
it's so much more time in an Ironman spent than in a half, and they're just using different energy systems in a half Ironman. And an Olympic distance to a half Ironman, I think, is certainly you can certainly take the information across to that. But basically, a half is just a really, really good place to practice some race skills, some racecraft. Um, you know, help fuel some competitive juices. But the data we get from it, I don't usually look at it and think, oh, this is going to be useful. Um,
Mhm.
most Ironman athletes will probably finish a half Ironman and feel like they push themselves quite hard, but I don't think they've actually got the full potential out of them because the timing of a half Ironman is right in the middle of an Ironman build, and we usually only allow 3 or 4 days to taper into it, and they might be carrying a little bit of fatigue, but it's more there just to keep them competitive, keep their mind in the game. But yeah, it's maybe the professional athletes there's a little bit of crossover, but
Mhm.
age group athletes I find it quite hard to take the information and carry it over.
Gotcha. I guess we'll have to have you on again for another race planning session for um, Olympic and half distance now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd love to do a half one. Actually, I need to find a race where I've got a lot of athletes doing a half, so I can use some good comparative information. We don't actually do a lot of Olympic distance races in New Zealand. It's a
Oh,
real shame
interesting.
because yeah, absolutely, I love racing that distance, but the Olympic distance tri scene in New Zealand has just sort of fallen away quite a bit, and
Hmm.
yeah, it'll be something I'd love to see more of. But yeah, if I can get some good data and some good information from athletes that race some of them in Australia, Noosa Triathlon or Mooloolaba Triathlon,
Yeah, yeah.
that'd be really interesting because I'd really love to dive into what an Olympic distance athlete does for their power and how we
Hmm.
plan for that. Because essentially, it's yeah, a 10K run is 100% of CP there or thereabouts,
Hmm.
but actually how hard can that bike or how much does a really hard bike in Olympic distance race affect? And I wouldn't be surprised if it's much lower than 100 percent. You know, it might be closer to 92, 94%. Even that might be quite hard to maintain. Be interesting to see.
Yeah, yeah. That's what kind of I've seen anecdotal evidence of as well
Mm,
in that range. So it's interesting to see the difference going up to full distance from there. Um,
yeah,
Well, I mean, great stuff here. I think we're already over an hour at this point. We can wrap things up, and for people who probably will watch this and might have some questions and tips. I know you're active in the Stride community Facebook
yeah,
group. They can
definitely.
also find you foottrafficcoaching.com is your website.
That's right. Yep. Or on Instagram, Foot Traffic Coaching, or on Facebook, they can just hunt me out.
Okay,
Happy
excellent.
to answer any questions.
We'll link to those as well in the description, and then I'm sure we'll get some more content out from you here soon. From the Stride team, I want to thank you, Rob, for coming on and sharing your knowledge and being a long time Stride user, Stride coach, and just sharing your information freely with the Stride community. So we
Thanks
thank
for
you, really
creating
appreciate it.
a Thank you. Thanks for creating a great product. That's making my job so much easier.
We try. It's to help with the coaching minds.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you in Kona.
Yes, for sure. We'll see you in Kona. Alrighty, thanks,
Thanks,
Rob.
mate. Cheers.